So it's my honor now to introduce Grant Brown.
Oh, thank you, Barb. You're much too kind, but thank you anyway. It really is it's a thrill to be here tonight. This will be the first talk I've given about the Ann Arbor car ferries in 10 years. And in truth, I never thought I'd be giving another one, but I'm awfully glad it has come about. And I'm awfully glad to see that there are so many people that still have an interest in the car ferries. My wife told me that I should make a kind of a disclosure before I got started, and I think I should probably do that. I'm going to be talking about some of the worst winters on the Great Lakes in the 20th century. And they were really tough, and the boats had a very hard time. I should point out that most years, the boats simply went across the lake. They didn't have a lot of difficulty. Even in later years, they didn't have a lot of difficulty on Green Bay, but those are not the years we're going to talk about. So with that, you are looking at a picture of the Ann Arbor car ferry Viking leaving Frankfort Harbor in the mid-1970s. And believe it or not, she is not stuck in the ice. The car ferries were powerful. They didn't get stuck very often, but when they did, it made for some great stories. And that's what we want to talk about. Some of the Ann Arbor's experiences with ice, with enough information about ice and its various forms so that the stories make sense. The freshwater ice of the Great Lakes is very hard, it's dense, it's difficult to break up, more so than sea ice. Sea ice contains salt, and salt lowers the density. It takes sea ice about a year of being frozen to become as hard and dense as Great Lakes ice. Ice can keep a boat from moving. Ice can crush a boat. Ice can take a boat where it doesn't want to go. And a very good example of the latter occurred in 1977 while Bruce Jewell was captain of the Viking. And Captain Jewell was caught in an ice floe that was carrying him north towards Point Betsy. And as he looked north towards the point, he realized that before long, the floe would carry him right across the shoals that extended out from the point, and that he would run aground. And not only would he run aground, he stood a very good chance of capsizing because the ice would just keep pushing against the side of the boat. And so to say he had a problem would be a vast understatement. Well, he gave himself a few minutes to look around. And then he picked up the radio phone, called down to the chief engineer, and he said, "Chief, you'll know before I do if we're running aground. And if so, I want you to open the seacocks and sink the ship." And so what he did is they started in for some open water that was near shore. And of course, the problem was the open water was near shore, which it could be very shallow. But he got there, they got through the water, he got turned around towards Frankfort and avoided a major problem. But the incident goes to show what a serious hazard ice is to shipping on the Great Lakes. When the Ann Arbor began operations in 1892, they were very much aware that ice would be a problem, and they built their ships to be icebreakers. You're looking at a picture of the Ann Arbor number 2. She was heavily constructed of wood, 5-inch oak planking near the bow. The bottom was wrapped in steel from about 4 feet above the waterline to about 4 feet below to protect it from the ice. And if you look at the bow itself, you see how it comes down, and then just above the waterline, it slants back. That was done on purpose. And the idea was that the boat would ride up on top of the ice and use the weight of the boat to help crush the ice. That turned out to be a good idea. Some 50 years later, the Coast Guard embodied the very same principle in the design of the Coast Guard cutter Mackinac. Now, by that time, they knew a lot more about it, and they could calculate the best angle to maximize the ability of the boat to crush the ice with its weight and to split the ice with its power. The Ann Arbor was very concerned that a big west wind would start blowing ice into Frankfort Harbor and simply fill it top to bottom and shut it off for the winter. And in truth, they had something to be concerned about, because there were times when the entrance to the harbor did fill with ice, and it was very difficult to get in and out. And for that reason, the Ann Arbor made a concerted effort to keep a boat in and out of the harbor at least once every day during the winter months. Now let's talk for a few minutes about ice. About 40 years ago, Lawson Brigham wrote a book in which he categorized some 24 different kinds of ice. Now, fortunately, we do not need to know all of those kinds of ice to understand the stories of the car ferries. A very few will get us by. We're looking at a picture of sheet ice on Crystal Lake. Sheet ice is formed when the lake gets relatively calm, skims over, and then it just gets thicker and thicker, depending on how long it stays cold. The early car ferries, such as the number 1, the 2, the 3, and the 4, those built through 1906, could plow through about 1.5 feet of sheet ice without having to stop. And that was considered very good for the time. Later boats, like the 5, the 6, the 7, and the Wabash, could plow through up to 3 feet of sheet ice without having to stop. The best icebreaker ever in the Ann Arbor fleet was the Viking. The Viking was a 1965 rebuild of the Ann Arbor number 7. And when she was rebuilt, she was given a diesel electric system that totaled about 6,000 horsepower. The Viking could plow through just about 4 feet of sheet ice without having to stop. Sheet ice that is attached to something, such as the shore, is known as an ice field. Sheet ice that is not attached to something is known as an ice floe. Where there's a crack in sheet ice, oftentimes big chunks of ice are forced up and down, forming a wall or windrow. Windrows can rise 10 to 15 feet in the air. They can go 15 to 25 feet below the surface. And it pretty much goes without saying that car ferries had a great deal of difficulty with windrows. The basic method of breaking ice was to plow into the ice under full power, go as far as you can, and then back off and do it again. Another method was backing. And here we see a picture of the Ann Arbor number 5 backing on Green Bay. Now, backing is not exactly what it sounds like. They don't just put the engines in reverse and back up. What they do is they bring the boat near the ice they want to break up, and then they put one engine ahead and one engine astern to create a circular current. And that circular current is what tears up the ice. Backing has one advantage, and that is that a ship seldom gets stuck backing because it's always clearing out something behind the stern. It also has a disadvantage, and that is that whenever you put one engine ahead and one engine astern, the boat's going to turn. And unless there's enough ice around the bow to keep it from turning, backing won't work. The boats got stuck just about the same way they broke ice. They plowed into the ice full power, went as far as they could, and then found they couldn't back off. Another way they got stuck is a little more difficult to follow, but we need to know about it. And that is that the boats came under pressure from the ice. And if you will, picture an ice field extending out from the Michigan shore 5 or 6 miles out into Lake Michigan. And then picture a west wind. That west wind is trying to blow the ice up onto the beach and into the woods. But the ice doesn't go up onto the beach and into the woods because the beach pushes back. Now picture a car ferry somewhere in that ice field. That car ferry comes under pressure, and that pressure exerts a surface friction that the car ferry simply cannot overcome. And in most cases, it will remain stuck until the wind changes direction. The basic method of breaking out a boat that is stuck in the ice is for one car ferry to go right alongside the other for its entire length, about 10 feet apart. I've talked with 5 former Ann Arbor captains, and each one has said the same thing. And unless you're within 10 feet, it won't work. Captain Jewell has explained that it is not quite as dangerous as it sounds, because once you start the pass, even a foot or two of ice between the boats will keep them apart. The trick is in starting the pass. And in truth, they were not perfect. I've read any number of log entries to the effect of hit boat 4 near the stern or hit boat 3 near the stern. Sometimes there was damage, sometimes there wasn't. But either way, they were not perfect. Another way of breaking boats out is backing. And here we see a picture of the Ann Arbor number 5 backing down on another car ferry, about to break her out. Oops, I think I went too far. A third method was known as spudding. And here we see some people spudding around an Ann Arbor car ferry in the early 1900s. Here's a little closer look at that. A spud is a long pole with a blade at the end of it. And the idea was that you would jam that blade down into the ice and break up the ice right next to the boat. And in doing that, you would free the boat so that it could get loose. Modern captains have said that spudding could not have worked. When a boat comes under pressure, no amount of cutting up a little bit of ice right around the boat would do any good at all. I suspect they're right, but it almost seems unfortunate because the Ann Arbor used spudding as a method of breaking boats out into the early 1940s. On February 2nd, 1900, Captain Frank Butler took the Ann Arbor number 1 out of Boston. I'll get there. The Ann Arbor number 1 out of Frankfort, bound for Menominee. It was midwinter. It was later than the boats usually ran, particularly across Green Bay. And so he had to know he'd have a difficult time, but he couldn't have imagined all that lay in store for him. He crossed the lake quite easily, passed through the Sturgeon Bay Ship Canal, but as he began crossing Green Bay, which was frozen, he began running into windrows. And each new windrow seemed to be just a little higher and steeper than the one before it. And finally, as he got over near Green Island, which is just about where I put the tip of the arrow, he got stuck. And he must have known he was pretty well stuck because he asked for help. And help came in the form of the Algoma, which was a 127-foot vessel from the Straits of Mackinac that was classified as an ice crusher. Now, whether the Algoma was any better icebreaker than the number 1, I have no idea. But she had one big advantage, and that is the number 1 was stuck. But that was about to change because as the Algoma approached the number 1, she struck something, and it was probably ice, that tore off 2 blades of her propeller. And now both boats were stuck in the ice. Well, it didn't take long for the 2 captains to realize they were there for the winter. But they weren't as isolated as you might think, because in those days, there was a winter stage that went right across the ice of Green Bay from the town of Sturgeon Bay on the Door Peninsula, right straight across to the ice to Menominee. There were about 5 or 6 of those stages a day. And as it turned out, the 2 ships were stuck about 100 yards from the path of the stage. And so they had no difficulty getting supplies. The crew was able to stay in touch with their families by mail. Captain Butler took his rifle and went over to Green Island to go hunting for rabbits. But over time, things began to deteriorate because the number 1 was leaking. And they could keep the water out, but to do that, they had to run the pumps 24 hours a day. And that meant they were burning too much coal. They were burning about 5 tons a day of coal. And before long, they had to start bringing coal out from Menominee by sleigh. And that was difficult. Car ferry employees, of course, by their very nature, were spoiled in the way they loaded coal. Normally, all they had to do was bring a carload of coal on board, place it over the bunkers, and then open the bottom of the car and let it all fall out. Now, it was all a matter of wheelbarrow and shovel. On the other hand, the crew didn't have much to do, and it may not have been so bad to have something that had to be done and that took some effort. On March 10th, the Door County Advocate wrote, according to all reports, the number one could not stand much of a squeeze in her present condition. And if she should happen to get caught in an ice jam, it would probably end her career. And I have no doubt that was true. In mid-March, the Coast Guard shut down all navigation lights on Green Bay. Now, why they waited until mid-March, we will never know. Certainly nobody had gone anywhere on the bay unless it was by a stage dog sled or something like that. There were no boats going anywhere. My own theory on that is that whoever made the decision lived a long way from Green Bay. Then on April 5th, the Ann Arbor number 3 left Frankfort, bound for Menominee, and her job was to break out the number 1 in the Algoma as well. She got across the lake quite easily. When they got to the Sturgeon Bay Ship Canal, they sent the second mate ashore to telegraph Frankfort to send the number 2 as well. And the following day, the 2 ships began fighting their way across Green Bay. And at first, that was fairly difficult. The windrows were still there. But later in the day, when they actually got near the number 1 in the Algoma, it wasn't that difficult to break the 2 ships out. And so the 3 and the 2 went on to Menominee, and the number 1 began towing the Algoma back towards Sturgeon Bay. And at first, that was pretty easy because they had the path of the 3 and the 2 to follow. But early the next morning, the number 1 struck something. It was probably ice that tore off 1 propeller and 1 shaft and sent them straight to the bottom of the lake. And now Captain Butler had a problem because he had damaged his rudder while he'd been stuck in the ice, and he had been manipulating the 2 engines to steer. And now, of course, he only had 1. But he was still in the path of the 3 and the 2. The ice kept him going in the right direction. But later in the day, when he got to Sturgeon Bay, the ice opened up. And now, of course, he couldn't steer. But I think by that time, the captain wanted to get back to Frankfort because he did the one thing he could think of. They brought the Algoma alongside. They lashed the 2 ships together. And using the power of the number 1 and the rudder of the Algoma, they limped their way into the Sturgeon Bay Ship Canal. Well, by now, the plan was that the 3 would come back and tow the number 1 to Frankfort. But Captain Butler just wasn't living well because there was a big north wind blowing, and it just wasn't safe to cross Lake Michigan with a tow. It was safe to cross the lake. The 2 went right back to Frankfort. But the 3 and the 1 spent all that night, all the next day, all that night, all the following day. And they finally decided they had to do something. And so they decided they would go northeast along the Wisconsin shore to a point near Pilot Island, and then southeast to Frankfort. And the idea was that they would never be in the trough of the waves. Well, about midnight, they actually got near Pilot Island. The tow line broke. It took another hour to get a new tow line on the number 1. And then they realized that the number 1 was running short of fuel. And if anything else were to go wrong crossing the lake, she could run out. And if she ran out, she could sink. And so with what I'm sure was a huge amount of frustration, they turned around, took the number 1 back to the Sturgeon Bay Ship Canal. The 3 went on to Frankfort, and the number 2 actually towed the number 1 to Frankfort the following day. And when she got there, she really was in pretty bad shape. The stern was all chewed up by the ice. 1 propeller and 1 shaft were gone. The rudder didn't work. The steel that wrapped the hull to protect it from the ice was mostly torn off. Captain Butler and his crew had been stuck in the ice of Frankfort ice of Green Bay for 63 days, been gone from Frankfort for 68 days. And I have to believe he came away with a new respect for the power of the lakes in winter. 24 years later, another captain gained respect for the power of the lakes in winter. We're looking at a picture of the Ann Arbor number 5 under the command of Bernard Tullidge, with the number 4 right behind her, crossing Green Bay in early March of 1924. This was the earliest the Ann Arbor had ever tried to cross Green Bay, and it was done for a purpose. Captain Tullidge had a guest on board. It was R.H. Reynolds, who was the chief of Marine, and his job was to determine whether large, powerful ships, like the number 5, could keep Green Bay open in the wintertime. It took them 2 days and 7 hours to cross Green Bay, but the trip was successful. And as a result of that trip, the Ann Arbor added the number 7 in 1925 and the Wabash in 1927. And those 3 ships, the 5, the 7, and the Wabash, essentially kept Green Bay open for the next 45 years. There were a couple of exceptions, but by and large, they won their battle with the bay. An interesting sidelight, when the 5 and the 4 actually got to Menominee, Captain Tullidge told the local newspaper that he was very upset with the driver of a Model T Ford who parked his car in front of his ship. And he said he had to stop his ship. And when the car finally moved, it was very difficult to get his ship moving again. Another very difficult year for the Ann Arbor was 1917. And that's a year in which Lake Michigan froze shore to shore. It's also the year in which the Ann Arbor's new flagship took 17 days to get from just south of Detroit to Frankfort. And she almost didn't get there at all. She came very close to spending the entire winter at the Straits of Mackinac. After she arrived, Captain Larson, who was in charge, may have wondered why he went to all the effort. He arrived on February 1st, and 9 days later, on February 10th, he was coming back from Kewanee at night. And I don't know if he knew this or not, but there had been a west wind for the past 24 hours that had been building up a very big ice field against the Michigan shore. Well, about 10:30 at night, he plowed right into it and got stuck. 3 hours later, the Ann Arbor number 5, coming back from Manitowoc, plowed into the same ice field and got stuck right alongside it. And about 10 hours after that, the Ann Arbor number 3, coming back from Manistee, plowed into the same ice field and got stuck a few boat lengths back. Now, when they got stuck, they didn't just sit there. The number 5 immediately fired up her 4th boiler for more power. That takes about 4 hours. They pumped out the forward tanks. They put water into the after tank, and then they moved a couple of rail cars back about 25 feet, all in an effort to change the weight distribution. And once they'd done that, they began to work the engines. And by that, I mean they would put the engines ahead and then astern, and then ahead and then astern, much as one rocks a car in the snow. After about 45 minutes, when nothing happened, they reversed the process. They put water into the forward tanks, out of the after tanks, began working the engines again. When dawn came, they put people out on the ice to begin spudding. Now, none of this worked because there was a westerly wind. The boats were under pressure. They couldn't overcome the surface friction, and they were not going to be able to move without a change in wind direction. That morning, the following morning, the wind did switch. And I say that this was the second day, the wind switched to the east. That should have helped boats 5 and 6, but it didn't. But the 3 did get loose. And by about 2 o'clock or thereabouts, the 3 had gotten the other boats loose, and the number 5 was leading the way into Frankfort. She got to within about 3/4 of a mile of Frankfort when there was a big windrow she had to go through. She plowed right into it, found she couldn't back off. The 6 got stuck right behind her, and the number 3 got stuck a few boat lengths back. Now, by now, the wind had swung to the south at about 20 miles an hour. You would have thought that would help, but it didn't. For whatever reason, and I think the log entry from the number 5 may explain it as well as anything. It talks about the ice pushing from the side. I'm just going to read it to you. Heavy ice in windrow shapes caused by fast moving and shoving piled up against ship's side, making it impossible to move without assistance or a shift of wind. And then at 8:30 p.m., it reads, wind freshened up and blowing a gale from the westward. Temperature was 2 degrees. And for the next several days, the wind stayed out of the west, the northwest, southwest. It occasionally swung to the north. It occasionally swung to the south. But when it did, the boats didn't get released. They were going to need an easterly wind to get them loose. The next day, some sailors from boats 5 and 6 went ashore for supplies. They brought them back on a bobsled, which they pretty much destroyed trying to get across the windrows. And so that afternoon, sailors from all 3 boats went out to try and cut a path through the windrows so that the next time they went for supplies, they could bring them back a little more easily. The following day, this would be day 4, the Ann Arbor number 4 arrived from Manistee. She got stuck about 2 miles to the southwest of the other boats. So now all 4 Ann Arbor boats were stuck outside of Frankfort. And for a railroad that shipped almost 40% of its tonnage across the lake, this was close to disaster. They had to do something. And they did. They hired some men from Frankfort to come out with dynamite. And the idea was they would blast the number 5 loose. And here is a picture of one of those dynamite charges going off in 1917. That night, the number 5 put crew members out on the ice to guard the holes. The following day, they rigged up a snatch block from the number 5 about 300 feet away so that they could haul ice away from the ship. The dynamite men came back. Some other men came back that were classified as ice cutters. And I think their job was to break up the ice into chunks that could be hauled away. They also rigged up a hot water hose. They thought maybe they could thaw the ice. And again, at night, they sent people out to guard the holes. The next day was more of the same. That night, the wind was hard from the southwest, which ended any real chance of getting loose. The following day, this would be day 7, some crew members went to Frankfort for supplies. And at this time, they brought them back on a sleigh that they rented from the local livery barn. And so whatever they did must have worked. The dynamite men, the ice cutters, the hot water hoses, those pulling the ice away from the ship were all working. But that afternoon, things began to go south on them. I think the dynamite people put too big a charge in because there was one big chunk of ice that blew over the top of the number 5, and it landed through the ceiling of the after pilot house. Another chunk landed through the ceiling of another cabin, and the log clearly states that the dynamite ruined the compass. Now, I don't know how it could do that. I do not understand that, but it's right there in black and white. The dynamite ruined the compass. They had to get a new compass. The next day, this would be day 8, was a Sunday. About 10 o'clock in the morning, some officials from the railroad came out to talk with the captains. We know they were there because they're logged in. We don't know who they were. They were not logged in by name. They stayed there about an hour. Sunday, of course, is a day of church, and quite a number of car ferry employees went into Frankfort and went to church. And I have a feeling this picture was taken on that day. I could be mistaken, but I just think after church, probably a number of people walked out on the ice to see the boats. And I would think that explains the presence of women out on the ice. The best news of the day occurred about 6:30 that night when the wind switched to the east. Overnight, boat 4 got loose. About 9:15 in the morning, boat 3 was loose. And by noon, all of the boats were free. And so the number 1 began to lead, or number 5 began to lead the way into Frankfort again. She had to go through one more big windrow. She got stuck in it, but the other boats were able to break her out. And by late afternoon, the temperature was falling through the teens. It was snowing, but all 4 boats were safe in Frankfort Harbor. The delays to the number 5 and number 6 had been just a little over 8.5 days. Now, an interesting sidelight. Once they got there, they didn't stay there. The next day, the number 5 with the number 4 right behind her left Frankfort for Manistee. It took them almost 24 hours to get there, but they did. And this was typical of the Ann Arbor. They did not stay in port because of ice. They always went out and fought the ice. Another very difficult year for the Ann Arbor was 1936. That's another year in which Lake Michigan froze shore to shore. I came across a radio log from the Ann Arbor number 6 that I found was very interesting. I'd like to read part of it to you. It was written by Carl D. Fredrickson, who was the purser. And I should explain that most radio logs are very uninteresting. A typical entry would be called Frankfort or Frankfort called us. They don't say anything, but this one did. And it starts on February 23rd, 1936, 3:37 p.m. Called Manistee, stuck in windrows about an hour and a half from Manistee and working to free ourselves. 8 p.m. Called Manistee, still stuck fast. I'm going to take another crack at her. Cleaned the fires. 9:07 p.m. Still stuck fast. Only a change in wind will let us free account of pressure. And that's the same pressure we've been talking about. February 24, 8:22 a.m. Still stuck and ice is pushing back. Unable to get loose until pressure stops. 9:07 a.m. Same position. Now the last 3 entries with which I'd like to conclude my talk. 10 a.m. Went down on ice and took 5 pictures of the boat and the fellows spudding the ice along her port side. Ice was packed 25 feet deep, and on the level, it was 3 to 4 feet thick. One windrow was 10 feet 7 inches high and 50 feet wide. No one of the crew has ever experienced a vision of ice in such form in the middle of Lake Michigan. Ice on all sides except on top, and when it snows, we will be entirely encrusted with ice of all kinds. 11:01 a.m. Broke loose at 10:50 a.m., trying to back away from this big field of windrows. Looks pretty bad on all sides now. And then the final entry, 1 p.m., a very simple, arrived Manistee.